Welcome to Transportation at a Crossroads, Safety, Policy, and the Future of Surface Mobility. Today's discussion is hosted by the Center for Transportation Advancement and the Tower K Group, bringing together policy experts to examine the safety and regulatory questions shaping the upcoming surface transportation reauthorization. Before we begin, let me introduce our panel. Michael Gorman, Professor of Business Analytics at the University of Dayton. Patrick McLaughlin, Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institute, and Marc Scribner, Senior Transportation Policy Analyst at the Reason Foundation. I want to thank everybody for being here today. Now, when most people in Washington think about surface transportation reauthorization, they think about funding, the billions of dollars that flow through the Highway Trust Fund for roads, bridges, and some rail projects. But the bill actually does a lot more than just fund infrastructure. It also sets the nation's regulatory climate, determining how safety rules are written and how new technologies like autonomous vehicles are going to be developed and implemented nationwide. We're doing this against a backdrop of a very, very strong safety record. Since 2005, train accident rates have fallen 40%, and derailments are down by 46%. In fact, 2025 was the safest year for rail transportation on record. And in the trucking industry, we see a very similar story. They had a little bit of a hiccup during the COVID years, but essentially they're on a very, very good trajectory. The challenge now is to make sure new regulations improve safety without imposing costs that slow innovation or operations. This was also the theme of DOT's recent National Autonomous Vehicle Safety Forum. So, with the current law expiring September 30th, Congress has only a few months to decide what belongs in the next bill and what does not. So, that's exactly what we're going to explore today with our panel. Since there is no draft bill, we'll try to gain insights from several pending pieces of legislation. And with that, let's begin. First question. Good regulations are typically performance-based. The Self-Drive Act requires autonomous vehicle manufacturers to develop a safety case for regulations, with NHTSA defining the content requirements. Does the bill give NHTSA enough guidance to ensure those requirements remain performance-based? If not, what language should we be adding? Marc, you want to try that one first?
Yeah, sure, David. And thank you, the Center for Transportation Advancement and Tower K Group, for putting this all together and inviting us. So let's first define what a safety case is. It's a structured evidence-based argument for a system's safety. In contrast, the Vehicle Safety Act authorizes NHTSA to promulgate minimum performance standards that must be, quote, stated in objective terms. The implication there is that manufacturers must be able to consistently test to a given technical standard. The Self-Drive Act, what it's getting at there with the safety case language, would allow NHTSA to issue objective content requirements for those safety cases rather than traditional objective performance requirements. And this is really a practical approach given the complexity and lack of consensus on automated driving system performance evaluation at present. It also underscores why NHTSA's existing statutory authorities are likely inadequate for enabling the near-term integration of autonomous vehicles into the vehicle safety regulatory ecosystem. Now, going forward, how to consistently assess those evidence-based claims contained in a safety case remains an ongoing technical project. However, there has been initial best practices put out by the Automated Vehicle Safety Consortium in October 2025, and I think that is precisely at what Congress is getting at with that bill and with that language.
Thanks a lot, Marc. Patrick, do you have any thoughts?
Well, this reminds me of in a former life, I worked at the Federal Railroad Administration, and we as a team at the FRA, were tasked with designing the performance tests that a train set manufacturer could subject their system to in order to show that the alternative design of a high-speed rail passenger train could pass those tests. So what we had, this was an incredible amount of work. The original regulations that we were trying to work around were written in the 70s. Essentially said you had to build a steel cage around your train that was containing passengers. Steel cages don't move very fast, so this was inhibitive to high-speed rail. High-speed rail manufacturers had built designs that you saw in Europe and Asia that would absorb shock from some sort of impact with like a cone on the front of the train, for example, that could absorb any sort of shock, and it worked as well or better than a steel cage. We worked with the team at MIT and the Volpe Center to develop tests that would show that such a cone absorbing shock would produce at least as much safety measured by secondary impact velocity for passengers, as compared to a steel cage. But that took years and years of work to develop those simulations. So I guess I feel the pain of not knowing exactly how to test something, and coming up with an alternative it seems like a viable approach to move forward.
Great. Thanks a lot, Patrick. Next question. There are currently several autonomous trucking pilot programs operating in Texas and in other states throughout the Southwest, generally in very much controlled hub-to-hub routes. While the Self-Drive Act focuses on passenger vehicles, the America Drives Act addresses autonomous trucking and would preempt conflicting state autonomous vehicle laws. Based on the safety records so far, are autonomous trucks ready for broader deployment? And what evidence suggests they may be safer or not than human-driven trucks? Marc, you want to try this one first again?
Yeah, sure. So it's all in the nature of the hardware and software that these vehicles are equipped with, in this case, trucks. While medium and heavy duty trucks have different physical and operating characteristics when compared to the light duty passenger vehicles that we have a growing amount of data on, especially from robotaxi developers like Waymo. An automated driving system will address the human error and misbehavior that are central to vehicle crashes in this country. So the strong safety case of autonomous trucks to date, while granted is more limited than the robotaxi evidence, is I think worth paying attention to, and it's worth keeping in mind that trucking is much more regulated than the operation of private vehicles. And even without new authorities, regulators have greater visibility into the commercial fleet and the power to immediately remove unsafe commercial motor vehicles from the roads. When it comes to preemption, I think given the fact that many of these routes are going to be interstate, having a common set of national rules makes a lot of sense. But this bill would instruct the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration to proceed with rulemaking on that. It's not going to happen overnight, but I think it's best, given the fact that we, like you said, we have a limited number of these vehicles on the road today in commercial service, that it's best to start now.
Along those lines, as you mentioned, at the National Autonomous Vehicle Safety Forum, Secretary Duffy announced efforts to modernize the federal motor vehicle safety standards to accommodate automatic vehicles. Are we going in different directions when it comes to rail and truck? Michael, we haven't heard from you yet. You want to take that one?
Sure. I can't speak to whether autonomous trucks are safer or less safe than a human driver, but I can tell you for sure that it's not nearly as safe as rail. But the rail regulation is moving in just the opposite direction. A few years ago in New Palestine, Ohio, there was a tragic incident. And as a result, there's a Rail Safety Act floating around, which, among other things, promotes a mandated two-man crew minimum. Never mind, there were 3 crewmen on that train, so it's kind of without foundation. But the idea, though, is that mandating more people on in piloting a train, so to speak, as opposed to fewer. Here's the odd thing: despite how notable that incident was, that same year, 2023, 5,500 people died in accidents related to trucks, and 1,000 of those were truckers, and 4,500 were not. They were just passenger vehicles who got tied up. That same year, five, 5,500, but five people died due to train accidents. And no one died at the derailment in Palestine. So not to dismiss the pain and suffering that is experienced. It's just completely off kilter on the idea that we would take railroads, which operate on a closed network. It's only trains. Every train's monitored and controlled via satellite. Trains don't even have a steering wheel. If there's any mode that's perfectly suited for autonomous operations, it's rail. And you experience this every time you go to the airport and you get in one of those trams that take you to your gate. The inconsistency of the policies is really it's palpable. It's really it's shocking. And unfortunately, I think there's some political grandstanding going on with senators from Ohio trying to get a vote, and perhaps rail unions who are looking to leverage an unfortunate incident to protect jobs. So in short, going the opposite direction is striking.
Yeah, 5 versus 5,500. There's certainly quite a disparity there. Marc, have you given this any thought?
Yeah, and I completely agree with what Michael just said. And there is absolutely more enthusiasm for road vehicle automation than rail automation among both the public and government officials. I personally suspect this bias is mainly due to the fact that most people do not directly experience rail transportation in their daily lives. Rail's lower profile, I think, means that policymakers and the public are going to need a lot of basic education even before automation is introduced into the discussion. But I do think that these are necessary discussions because, as Michael pointed out, it's much simpler to automate rail in one dimension than it is a motor vehicle operating in two dimensions. And because the private and public benefits of rail automation in a number of domains are very large. So I hope we can start having more serious discussions about the benefits of rail automation.
Yeah, I mean, I forget which one of you all pointed it out, but certainly when you go to an airport and you're on a tram system, well, that's completely autonomous. To my knowledge, there is no driver, and the system seems to work perfectly fine. Patrick, did you have any thoughts on this question?
I do. Well, I agree with both Michael and Marc, but I think there's another force at play here. In Washington, you always have to ask the question, who gains by some new policy? And in the case of mandating a minimum crew size on freight trains, as the Railway Safety Act would do, it's clear that the railroads wouldn't be gaining from that. It's going to be a costlier operation, and the railroads, maybe they choose to do that on their own if that makes things safer, but railroads are going to pursue safety in whatever dimension works best for the system. And that dimension may not be putting more people in the cab of a locomotive. It's clearly not the consumers. I have a study that's coming out that shows that a 5% increase in overall regulation leads to a roughly 2 to 3% increase in prices that consumers face. So the regulation of the rail sector of freight is going to cause your prices to go up for obvious reasons. Everything that you buy at some point is shipped. And so it's not the consumers who does benefit. It's probably those people who have those jobs on those railroads. And I think this is explained by, you look at union density. The percentage of railroad employees that are in unions is roughly 54%, and then compare that to trucking, it's about 7%. So the beneficiaries of this bill would be those people working in those unionized jobs, and that's probably a force at work here.
Okay. And I suspect that 7% is probably highly concentrated across a handful of companies, if I'm not mistaken, probably, UPS and FedEx and whatnot. Whereas most of the TL space is going to be all non-union. Uh, yeah. Anyway, yeah, I recall this similar arguments years ago with regard to cabooses and whether or not we still needed cabooses when you had end of train monitors that could do the same job. So it seems like it's a fight that keeps repeating itself, and largely, as you pointed out, Patrick, to the detriment of the consumer ultimately. Uh, okay. Next question. So, railroads have made significant safety progress. Accidents are down 40% over the last 2 decades. FRA research has found that wayside detection systems are associated with fewer derailments, and railroads largely deployed these systems voluntarily. Would the trackside automation provisions in the Railway Safety Act meaningfully improve rail safety, or risk mandating technologies the industry is already implementing and curtail future innovation? Michael, you want to take this one?
You're exactly right. Yeah, the FRA calls the U.S. rail network the safest in the world. And as you might know, 2025 set safety records in the rail industry. So the rail industry is moving in the right direction and doing it exceeding FRA standards. And the reason is because there's an economic incentive to do so. As terrible as New Palestine was, Norfolk Southern paid $600 million for that event. And so there's a good reason to want to avoid it. Railroads focus on safety. They really do. I worked for one for years, and that was rule number one. The problem with this policy is that it's outdated. It's outdated before the ink dries. Bearings account for about 5% of derailments. It's a really small slice of the problem. And even though derailments have fallen dramatically over the last 25 years, bearing-related accidents are small. This policy I've estimated roughly $2 billion for the rail industry. It's a very rough estimate, but it's a lot of money. And that's money that won't be spent elsewhere that have real safety benefits. The technology is outdated. There's onboard telematics, there's AI-powered high-resolution inspection cameras, digital twins, ultrasonic wheel detection, all of which is going to be supplanted by sticking these boxes every 15 miles all over the rail network. And the boxes are less effective than newer technologies. The more specific the statutory mandate, the more likely it's going to be outdated before it even goes into effect. And this is one of those cases. I think Congress should mandate outcomes, not technologies. You don't tell the railroads how to operate. You tell them what they need to do to be safe enough. Demand a certain level of safety and measure that safety, and don't prescribe a particular remedy. And if you look at rail safety record, it's exemplary. And the costs that this will impose on the rail industry inevitably will chase freight to truck, which I've already described is 1,000 times more deadly than rail. And the idea to make rail marginally safer and cost so much money to the railroads and eventually consumers, and even more so when this freight gets traced to truck, it's just bad policy, unfortunately. Trucks pollute, they cause more road damage than they pay for, they clog up our roads. And that's where we're going if we overregulate the safest mode in the US and chase business away from it. And so
so if I can just quickly summarize, it seems like we would spend a lot of money for really nothing. And in fact, it might be a net negative if you end up chasing more freight to truck, which is, you gave the statistics earlier, 5 versus 5,500 deaths in 2023. That's an incredible disparity. Let's see, Patrick, you have any thoughts on this?
I think Michael said it well when he pointed out the need to trust measurable outcomes more. I think if there's any sort of action here, and it's not clear there needs to be, but if there is, it should be one that leads to more performance-based regulation, looking at measurable outcomes and the performance that you see as opposed to prescriptive design. And again, the way of thinking about the safety of any of these systems, whether it's trucking or rail, is the whole picture. Humans are involved, machines are involved, the track is involved, the roadway is involved. All of these different components have an effect on overall safety. And if you have a set of regulations that lock in certain components with a specific prescriptive design standard, lock in the use of one type of technology, that limits what you can do for the entire system. And that is, in the long run, to your point, David, possibly detrimental, not safety enhancing. because now you're limiting how the whole system can progress. Instead of having those prescriptive design standards, you should trust the measurable outcomes and then let the railroads or the other manufacturers figure out the best way to meet and exceed those measurable outcomes.
Marc, I think you've done some writing on this. Do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with what Michael and Patrick said on these wayside equipment requirements in the Railway Safety Act being highly prescriptive and running counter to the performance-based regulatory design principles we've been talking about and are widely recognized as best practices. But I do think it's also worth pointing out that these provisions also violate key National Transportation Safety Board recommendations that followed the East Palestine accident. Those recommendations were that regulators first analyze wayside equipment performance and use before imposing any new mandates. So this is putting the cart before the horse, even when it comes to the NTSB accident report of the incident that this bill is supposedly in response to.
So it sounds like a solution in search of a problem. Michael, you brought up something interesting. You said that bearings, I think you said, only account for 5% of all derailments. Was that correct?
That's right.
If yeah, and I don't want to put anybody on the spot here, but if anybody, what is there a major cause right now of railroad accidents or derailments? Does anybody know?
You should track flaws.
Track flaws.
That's the number one cause. And the vast majority of these derailments occur in rail yards. The Hoover trains are not moving very quickly at all. It might be just a single car. So we think of derailments as these massive, explosive 100-car train tipping over kind of things. And they're all reportable. It's like hitting the curb with your back tire while you're parallel parking. And it would be reportable to the FRA.
Yeah, I'm curious. Do you know what percentage of derailments occur in railroad yards by any chance?
Offhand, I don't have that number.
No. Okay. All right. Yeah, that's fascinating that most of them are, in fact, in railroad yards. And obviously, if you're in a rail yard, you're not moving very fast. Let's see. Next question. The Railway Safety Act would require two-person crews on most Class 1 freight trains. Would a federal two-person crew mandate enhance safety? What does the evidence actually show? Michael, I know you've talked about this some before. What are your thoughts?
I'll just quote the FRA here. In 2018, they said the record is clear. There is no evidence that two-person crews are safer than a one-person crew. It further said no regulation of train crew staffing is necessary or appropriate for railroad operations to be conducted safely. This is the FRA after years of study. I'll repeat, there were 3 crewmen on that train, so the two-person rule doesn't even apply here. It does not address the issue, right, at all. It just it's political tack on. I think it's promoted by opportunism and supported by unions to protect jobs. If you look at these two things in side by side, rail and truck regulation, where one there's no driver and the other there must be two. The incoherence seems absurd. The green light trucking, which is inherently more dangerous, it operates in an open network with passenger vehicles. And then to somehow cause rail to stagnate and impose more rules seems backwards, especially since rail is orders of magnitude safer. So, I'd urge policymakers to resist the temptation to overregulate the mode that's already working, not to have a knee-jerk reaction to a single event, and just ask a simple analytical question: will this policy save more lives than it costs? Because there's going to be modal shift as a result of these two very different changes in cost structure. Trucking becoming less expensive, rail becoming more expensive, or at least not able to move. And I think the answer is certainly not.
Yeah, it's ironic right now when you see the emphasis on deregulation within the Trump administration, using regulations that are performance-based. It's ironic that the Railway Safety Act is such a U-turn away from that standard and that philosophy. Patrick, having worked for the FRA, what do you think?
Well, I do think it's worth highlighting one of Michael's points there, which is the modal shift that this would create. It's worth repeating because when regulation in one of these modes goes up, you should expect to see some shift to other modes. And if those other modes are inherently more dangerous, then that may run net counter to safety. But going back to the statistics on two-person versus one-person versus zero-person crews. I looked into this in detail when the FRA first proposed a minimum crew size rule in the Obama years. I looked at it in detail again when it proposed it again in the Biden years. And I agree with the FRA's statement that Michael just said. There is no evidence, no statistical evidence that a one-person crew operating in the U.S. is any less safe than a two-person crew in the U.S. We have plenty of data here. I'll highlight a probable reason for that. For the most part, freight rail is operated by two or even more person crews. As Michael pointed out, the East Palestine crew size was three. But there are places where they've used one person crews and they're very selective. They're very deliberate in choosing where to do that. The railroads are very cognizant of the need for safety. They want to preserve their employees and equipment. They want to avoid accidents. And so where they are operating with one person crews, they've ensured that the system around the one person crew is capable of handling it. And that's probably why you see no difference in safety. If an additional person in the cab were to increase safety, the railroad would do it. If it's not adding safety, because the railroads accommodated that with other parts of the system, then they should be able to choose to do a one-person operation. And then one other point here, if we look around the world and look at some standards in places like Australia and Canada, there's even less evidence, and there is no evidence, that a two-person crew would lead to more safety. In Australia, they've been running freight lines in robust systems with zero-person crews, complete automation there. And we're not seeing any detriment to safety there. And again, it's because the system is designed as such. And in Canada, there are several lines with one-person crews in operation. And in order to get approval from regulators there, the railroads do have to show that their system can accommodate the changes in risk. But once they show that, they're able to operate one-person crews. And again, you don't see them being any less safe than crew sizes that are larger than one.
Yeah, you noted in Australia they're running robust systems. I mean, when a lot of us think of Australia, think of huge populations on the coastal areas, nobody in the center. This isn't just the Australians running, long freight trains hundreds of miles across what are essentially open land, is it? It's you said they're robust systems.
Yeah, I think they probably run the gamut. There's certainly a lot of those trains that are crossing open lands, but there's also population to deal with. I think considering where the train is operating is very relevant too, and that should be part of any railroad's design and would be part of any railroad's design. Maybe a system is better suited if there's lower population for a zero-person crew, but maybe not. I think there's other technological means of dealing with that.
Now, you said in Canada they're allowed to operate one-person crews with a waiver. Is there a formalized process are there certain standards they have to meet before
Yeah,
they get that waiver? How does that work?
it's a formalized process. They have to show that the overall risk of the route wouldn't be changed by changing the crew size. But yeah, mentioning waivers is another good point. There's a difference between a process and requiring a waiver. And I do think we need to make sure that if we're having some sort of process that would allow technological improvements that train systems or trucking systems are making to change how other parts of the operation goes, including crew size, then we shouldn't have to trust in a waiver for that sort of improvement of the technology overall. You never know what a future administration is going to look like and whether they'll be amenable to waivers.
So again, it really gets back to, let's have known performance standards that one needs to meet, and if you meet those standards, you can run your desired crew size. I mean, I think again, it gets back to what I touched upon in the beginning. If you have set performance standards, you're much more likely to get much better outcomes. Marc, I know you've certainly thought about this.
Yeah, and completely agree with Michael and Patrick again on this point. And Australia for more than 5 years they've had zero-person crewed trains operating 500 miles in Western Australia from the iron ore mines to the port. It's a system called Auto Haul that Rio Tinto worked with Hitachi on, and the safety record there is phenomenal. But back to the U.S. and FRA on this question, what's interesting, Patrick mentioned this was first proposed during the Biden administration or the Obama administration, excuse me. And when it was first proposed, the draft proposed rule that FRA initially submitted claimed that studies show that one-person train operations pose increased risks. Strangely enough, it was the Obama White House Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, the watchdog of significant regulatory actions, that flagged that and made the FRA take out that claim. So what we were left with the proposed rule that was published was FRA admitting that it has no reliable or conclusive statistical data to suggest that two-person crews are safer than single-person crews. So FRA has long admitted this and conceded this point, but sometimes begrudgingly.
Oh, fascinating. Okay, one more question. The railway bill would also expand the definition of high hazard materials transported by rail. What would be the practical impact of that change? What are the safety benefits and the potential downsides? Michael?
Thanks, David. Yeah, the expansion would make considerably more trains be considered as hazmat trains. I think that right now, I think the policy is just flammable liquids. They're going to expand to flammable gas and also lower the number of cars with hazmat to qualify as a hazmat train. And by doing that, the number of hazmat trains would grow. And hazmat trains require extensive safety reviews, advanced braking systems. They operate under speed restrictions. They have to operate in different car handling rules and different routes, all of which slows down rail, makes it less consistent, more costly, less competitive. So depending on where the threshold is set, the number of trains considered hazmat could jump dramatically, and that would dramatically affect the way railroads operate. And a rational shipper is going to look at that aggravation, higher cost, slower service, more inconsistent service that's imposed by these regulations, and naturally look elsewhere. And as covered, that elsewhere is trucking, and trucking is not as safe. Chemicals they travel by rail are on average far safer than the same chemicals traveling by truck. And by overregulating rail, you'll chase those same chemicals off of railroads and onto trucks. And in the public highway system, of course, the fatality rate is much higher. Operating amongst passenger vehicles is much less safe. So Congress should ask not whether the regulation is well intentioned. It sounds great to have zero tolerance, a death penalty for jaywalking, but whether it has unintended consequences, and whether they've accounted for modal substitution.
Yeah, it seems like you're right with regard to modal substitution. If you're going to simply shift a considerable amount of cargo from rail to truck, you're really not making the overall system safer. But then secondly, it also seems to me like, if you're trying to rebuild your industrial base from a competitive standpoint, we spend, I think, it's $6 trillion a year on transportation, which are simply a cost. So anything we can do to work those costs out of our overall logistics system makes the UMS that much more competitive. Patrick, any thoughts on this question?
I apply first principles here. We've touched on it before. The importance of thinking about performance standards versus design standards within regulatory policy. And one part of this this dealing with high hazard trains is, as Michael mentioned, speed caps, and that's not a performance standard. That is a specific locking in of one part of the system. You're stuck at that speed, even if you were to improve other parts of the whole train set, improve your tank cars so that they were much different and better than they are now, but you still are stuck at that same speed. Other sorts of design requirements related to this are the problems here. It's not having some sort of measurable outcome that allows technological improvement. That's the major flaw I see in this component of the bill.
Okay, and just Marc, before we get to you, I know you've had some thoughts about this, but when you're shipping hazardous materials, obviously it's going to be on a mixed train of some sort. Is the train then regulated by whatever the most hazardous material on that entire train is? Is that how it works, or is there something else that guides them? Anybody know?
It has to do with the density, the fraction of the rail cars that are in fact considered hazmat. I don't know the exact numbers right now, but clearly that number's falling with the Rail Safety Act to an undetermined number at this point. But
Sure.
Theoretically, then one rail car that has a newly defined hazardous material could cause the whole train to be considered hazmat.
Hazmat, yeah, and that would, yeah, that's really what I was getting at. Marc, you have any thoughts?
Yeah, just kind of emphasize some of the points that Michael and Patrick have made. So what and going back to the NTSB report on the East Palestine accident, what they were after with their recommendation on high hazard flammable trains, it's about these multiple cars triggering a reaction, a cascade of hazardous materials release. That's what they're really concerned about, and that's what these kind of requirements are concerned about. So, like Michael said, what they would do, or what the NTSB recommends, would be to expand the covered materials to include things beyond flammable liquids, so combustible liquids, and then the flammable gases. But if you look at what the Railway Safety Act includes in its definition, it includes non-combustible substances that could not initiate or propagate a cascade of hazardous materials release. So again, this bill, even when you look at it and you see kind of what they're trying to do, it fails to line up with what the NTSB's accident investigation findings and recommendations say. So I think that on this point and on this provision, again, they need to go back to the drawing board.
Excellent. Well, we are quickly running out of time. I'm just going to close with some final thoughts. Obviously, when it comes to autonomous trucking and autonomous vehicles in general, the nation appears to be on a very, very thoughtful path that will likely someday lead us to truly autonomous trucks, particularly in long haul corridors that will be safer than human drivers. That's a good thing. From the trucking industry's perspective, we know that reduces their cost by at least 40%, if not more. Unfortunately, we seem to be going in the opposite direction anyway with the Railway Safety Act. Let's hope that the surface transportation reauthorization gets us going in the right direction with regard to, again, we want to keep a close eye on safety, but we also need to make the country more competitive and give us the opportunity as a nation to truly explore and be leaders in new technology. So at that, I want to thank our panelists for a thoughtful and very substantive discussion. And thanks everyone for attending today. Transportation at a crossroads, safety, policy, and the future of mobility. If you have any questions, comments, or would like to continue the conversation, please refer to the closing slide, which includes our contact information. So again, thank you to our panelists. Thank you for everyone for joining us for today, and we hope to see you at future discussions from the Center for Transportation Advancement. Thank you very much.